Well, let's bring in the Scottish Labour MSP, Daniel Johnson, who's the party's spokesperson on the economy and finance. Hello, Daniel Johnson.
Good afternoon.
Do you agree with Humza Yousaf there? This is all just the Tories' fault.
Look, there are very significant global factors at play, no doubt, but you can't ignore the data. And if you look at the OECD data, the inflation figures for the UK economy are in excess of all our comparator economies, particularly for food and for energy. And that is a result of Tory mismanagement. We saw absolutely disastrous consequences, borrowing costs shooting up as a result of the mini budget. And we are still living with the consequences of those decisions today, and in particular in the inflation figures that we have in front of us.
Are you sure about your numbers for energy? Because I'm on the FT website and I looked at this earlier on, and the UK natural gas cost is below the EU comparator, below Italy, below Spain. Its electricity is the one that's higher. But I wouldn't say that the UK appears to have the highest energy costs compared to all of our comparators.
I was just reading off an OECD report, which was based on figures, albeit 2 months out of date, but year on year, that was what certainly the figures I was looking at were showing me. But I think whatever way you look at it, we're going to have the slowest growth in the G7. We've got some of the highest inflation, and you have to ask yourselves why. And clearly, you can't look much further than those disastrous decisions that were made back in the autumn.
I think your party said before, or many of them, many members have said before, it was Brexit. Do you agree with that?
I think there's a broad range of factors. There's no doubt that the mismanagement of the economy, which includes the arrangements that have been made through Brexit, have made life more difficult both for households and for businesses. And I think one of the things Labour have said quite clearly is that we need to strike deals so that we have things like professional qualifications recognised between us and the UK and the EU. And measures like that could make a difference. So I think we have to look at all the sources and factors for the inflation and have to address them in a pragmatic way, as opposed to the sort of dogmatic economic madness that we've seen from the Conservatives.
Interesting then. Can we just stick on Brexit? Because apocryphally, people would say Brexit is at the root of many of these issues. And many Labour members voted for Brexit in England. But the Shadow Chancellor, Rachel Reeves, said on BBC Breakfast that the inflation problem is partly because of the Brexit trade deal. So would you accept that many of your members voted for Brexit and Brexit is part of the issue here?
I mean, I do, and you're quoting Rachel Reeves, is that the way that these things have been handled, but because of the complexity of Brexit, we have to find a practical and pragmatic way forward, which includes some of these bilateral measures that I've mentioned that Labour have already announced. So we have to deal with the situation that we have in front of us, and have to accept that it's because of incredibly poor Conservative management of the economy that we find ourselves in the situation we do today.
What would you do then? Because many of the central banks around the world have had the same issue. There's this spike in inflation that we've just gone through in many countries. I mean, in Africa, inflation is at 20-odd%. I think in Pakistan it's more than that. And in some countries in South America, it's over 100%. But in Europe in general, it's about 5%-ish. We are 7.9%. So we're 2% above France. So therefore, somebody's got to try and get inflation down. If you were in charge now, what would you do that would bring inflation down?
Look, I think one of the really interesting things, and clearly both you and I have been looking at different graphs and figures, is actually the variation in energy inflation across developed nations. And I think, particularly there's a big difference between, for example, Italy and Spain when you look at that. And part of that's to do with the way that energy policy has been undertaken. So, whether it affects this in the short term, I think is maybe an open question, but clearly in the long term, because of the transition to net zero, because of energy insecurity, we have to deal with that. I think it's one of these things where if it works in the short term, great, but in the long term, it has to be the right bet. The more we can help people move away from burning fossil fuels, and the more we can do that quickly and efficiently, the better. So I think the one overarching policy priority for me would probably be that.
But if you look at the graphs in detail, which I am now, Energy's not the main. Energy's not the main problem.
Food is the
the main problem. All items. Energy is the same as all the other items. So all items in a big basket is the same as energy. When you're talking about inflation, the major issue is food, and that is that not to do with things like Brexit, because we did import stuff from Europe.
Which is why we have to take a pragmatic approach to look at these frictions at the border, which can be dealt with, which we've talked about having to be dealt with, and we know that that's slowing things up. And really, there's been a complete failure by the UK government, by the Conservative Party, to anticipate those problems and deal with them. This is not beyond the wit of governments to deal with this. There are other borders which manage to deal with it, but they've just failed to really address the problems.
One of the big topics of this last week or so has been the two-child cap. And I think most people listening to you and me will be thinking, what's the difference now between Labour and the Conservatives? Because taxation plans roughly the same, spending plans roughly the same. We've got a cost of living crisis, and you are deciding not to change this two-child cap. It's a choice, and this is even though Keir Starmer 2 years ago said he would scrap it. You're not scrapping it, so therefore the SNP are seeing a wee gap here.
As we've already been discussing, we don't get to choose the economic circumstances that an incoming government may inherit. And the decisions made by the Conservatives mean we just simply cannot afford to make unfunded, uncosted decisions ahead of time. So let me be clear, Scottish Labour remain of the view that the two-child cap is abhorrent, and we will continue to make that argument. But I do understand the very difficult decisions that colleagues will be faced with if they are returned into government. And that's the very difficult predicament that my UK colleagues find themselves in.
And the argument against that you'll see everywhere as well, there's money for lots of other stuff, from nuclear weapons, etc., etc. So you would argue for this to be scrapped, but the issue for you is that the SNP are lumping you in the same basket as the Conservatives, and when you were hoping to get votes from the SNP, this policy down south that's been announced might well scupper you.
Well, but the only problem with that is that the SNP have only one argument and one thing that they want to talk about. They want to reheat constitutional arguments, whereas we want to deal with economic realities that we're faced with right now.
Well,
so
you're talking about the two-child cap.
And we will make, Scottish Labour will continue to make those arguments, and there will also be a review of universal credit, which will include these measures, because there's a vast range of iniquities and unfairnesses in the way that universal credit works. We want to look at that in the round. That is something that an incoming Labour government will do, and as part of that, the two-child cap will be part of that review.
OK, Scottish Labour MSP Daniel Johnson, thank you.